Hello and welcome this evening to this talk. I'm really excited to introduce Ben Dyson, who's the founder of the PositiveMoney campaign group, who were there, and he's going to talk about tonight how our economic system leads to social inequality and how a simple change can change this. He's co-authored the book, Modernizing Money, and I'm sure tonight will give us lots of food for thought and some interesting debate afterwards for question and answers. I'd like to thank the Annual Fund for making this talk possible and XTV for filming it for anyone who wants to recap later. So without further ado, please welcome Ben.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start with a thought experiment. I want you to imagine that you're on this boat and it's the middle of the night and suddenly you hear the sirens going off and the boat, unfortunately, is going down. You've got to get off, you've got to get into the sea, and it just so happens that you are within reach of this beautiful island. Okay, so everybody ends up on the beach here. Everybody's fine, nobody's hurt, you're all just a bit wet. And then you realize you have no idea how far you are from civilization. You have no idea when somebody's going to come and pick you up. And somehow you guys have got to survive on this island. You've got to find a way of keeping everybody alive. So you know, initially everybody starts chipping in. Some people go out to find some firewood. Some people go out to find food. But eventually you realize that some people are working harder than others, and some people aren't really chipping in. You know, you've spent the whole day out in the forest cutting down trees. When you come back, there's some people who've been clearly lying around all day, just enjoying the sun. So eventually somebody says, look, I think we need to sort out this situation. We need a way of keeping track of, you know, who's contributing to the community on the island, who's chipping in, and who isn't. And so somebody says, well, what if, like, here's an idea. What if we used tokens? And say, for example, you would get some tokens when you did something for the community, whether it was getting food or getting clean water or chopping firewood. And then you would get you would use these tokens to buy things, you know, buy the food that other people have collected. And somebody says, well, that sounds like something that we had when we were on the mainland. Didn't we used to use those pieces of paper to do that? And then somebody else says, well, yeah, I mean, wasn't it called money? I think that's what we were using. But you've all left your wallets on the boat in the rush to get off. So, so then, as you sat around the campfire, you had this discussion of who is actually going to create the money or the tokens that we're going to use to manage ourselves and to manage this community that's stranded on the island until you get picked up. And at that point, 3 different groups of people come forward with 3 different ideas about how to create the money. And then the first one says this, look, we'll create the money, and then we'll lend it to whoever is going to use it in the best way, and we'll charge some interest for running, for providing that service. Okay. Alternatively, the second group says, we'll create the money, and then we'll just pay people to do things for the community. So whenever anybody, you know, gets food or gets water, they'll get some of these tokens for that, and then they can cash them in for the things that they need. Or the third option is, look, we'll create the money, but we will give it equally to everybody. Everybody will get an equal share of the money we create, and they will be able to spend it how they want. So you've got these 3 options, and then there's got to be a discussion about which one you would choose. So what I want you to do now is just discuss with the person next to you which of these 3 options you think would have the best outcome for your little community on this island. Which one would end up with the best result, and the reasons why. And then in a couple of minutes, I'll ask a few people just to say what they chose and why. So go ahead. Yeah.
Just watch this.
Yeah, I'm standing. Yeah. Okay, let's hear what people were thinking then. Okay. So just want to do a quick show of hands, see what options people went for. So who went for the first option? Nobody at all. That's the first time that's ever happened. The second option? Okay, and the third option? That's about 50-50. So does anybody want to say why they went for the second option? Okay, so with the second option, you have to contribute something before you get something. That's, yeah. Well, it's just dropping off the bottom there. But did anybody, who chose for the third option and would like to say reason why? Yeah.
Well, the reason why we didn't pick two.
That's a really interesting point. It's the question is who's deciding what they pay for and how that money is spent. So I think that I'll just move this down a bit. I think that is a big problem with depending on which option. There are pros and cons of every one of these systems, and it's really about which one we want. But the reason why I wanted you to think about this is because essentially, this is a bit of a cliche, but everybody knows that money is power. If you have money, you can control what people do. From the time you start working until you retire, you spend about 1 of every 4 hours working for money, including the time that you are sleeping and your weekends. So, so if you give somebody control over money, and particularly the power to create money, then they have a lot of power over society and the kind of economy that we have. So there's some real issues at the moment with the way that money is created in the current economy, and I'm going to explain what these are. We're going to start with the question of where does money come from? So, let's see, who makes these? Bank of England. It's the Royal Mint, but it's really close. What about these? Bank of England. Yeah, the clue's on the side on this one. What happens if you try and make your own? It's something that looks a bit like this. So we all know you can't just print your own money at home. That's completely illegal. But there is a twist, because... You can mine Bitcoin, though. We can talk about that later. Because coins and banknotes are only 3% of all of the money that exists. So what about the other 97%? Well, firstly, what is that 97% of money? It's just numbers in a computer system. It's just the numbers that you see when you check your bank balance. And those numbers are actually created by the banks, the same banks that were implicated in the financial crisis. When you walk into when you walk into a bank to take out a loan, that money isn't coming from somebody else's life savings. They effectively type new money into your account at that point. So normally, the first time somebody hears this, they find it really hard to believe, because if it's illegal for you to print money at home, surely it's not legal for banks to create new money just by typing a few numbers on a computer keypad. So I'll just show you this. This is a paper that the Bank of England released back in March of this year. And this is what they said in there. They were explaining the process by which money is created. And this is what they said. So commercial, that's high street banks, create money in the form of bank deposits by making new loans. When a bank makes a loan, for example, to someone taking out a mortgage to buy a house, it does not typically do so by giving them thousands of pounds worth of banknotes. Instead, it credits their bank account with a deposit the size of the mortgage. At that moment, new money is created. So every time somebody takes out a loan, the banks and the banking system creates brand new money. This is the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times. Just the way he described it is this. He said, the essence of the contemporary monetary system is the creation of money out of nothing by private banks, often foolish lending. Okay. So how this affects the economy depends on what the banks do with the money that they create. And I'll show you how much money they have created. Firstly, this is starting in about 1964. So this blue line shows you how much money has been created by the banks, starting off with about 29 billion in 1970. That green line at the bottom is the cash created by the government. So we're now up to 107 billion in 1980. It's tripled in the space of 10 years because banks have been making more loans, and that's been creating new money. Then it nearly increased fivefold over the next 10 years, and then 857 billion pounds created by year 2000, And then this is what happened over the next few years up to the financial crisis. So we went in the space of 40 years from 29 billion pounds in the entire economy to having 2,185 billion. And this, the economy grew in that time, but it didn't grow anything like at that speed. So then the question is, like, where did all that money go and what impact did it have? Well, if we look at just the 10 years running up to the financial crisis, the new money that banks created in that 10 years, this is where it went. So 51% of it went into property, into mortgages to buy homes or commercial mortgages to buy office buildings. 31% of it went into the financial markets. Just 8% went into non-financial businesses. So this idea that everybody has, that banks have the job of taking money from savers and going to invest it in businesses, that's kind of a fairy tale. It's a really tiny part of what banks do these days. And then the remaining 8% went into personal loans and credit cards, so like personal debt. So just to emphasize that, the majority of lending that banks do does not go to business. It goes to the property market and to financial markets. Many people have a completely different idea that banks spend most of their time lending to businesses. Okay, so what about the debt? So think about this. If money is created when banks are making loans, then there has to be a pound of debt for every pound of new money that is created. So all of that money that I just showed you on that chart has some corresponding debt there. And what this means is if we want to get more money into the economy, we have to go further into debt. That's just the dynamics of the current system. The only time money is created is when people borrow from banks. We had, in the years after the crisis, we had David Cameron was about to say in a speech that everybody needs to pay off their credit cards for the sake of the nation. But one of his speechwriters stopped him before he actually said this, because, and the reason was, think about this, if money is created when banks make loans, what will happen when those loans are repaid? It's going to disappear, yeah. It's exactly the reverse process. The way Bank of England describes it is this. They say, just as taking out a new loan creates new money, the repayment of bank loans destroys money. Banks making loans and consumers repaying them are the most significant ways in which bank deposits are created and destroyed in the modern economy. Okay. So we have this equation. If we want to get more money into the economy to help the economy grow, then we have to take on more debt. And also this, if we want to have less debt, for example, if people borrowed too much and that led to a financial crisis, and now we want to pay down that debt, well, if we want to have less debt, then we're going to end up with less money in the economy as well. So this is a real problem. I gave a talk quite recently to a load of debt advisors working for the Citizens Advice Bureau and debt advice charities like that. And you think about the situation they're in. They sit in these offices where they have what seems like an infinite queue of people coming in with debt problems, asking for advice. They were under the impression that if they could just give enough advice to enough people and those people could get out of debt, then the economy would be better and society would be better off. What they didn't realize, obviously because not many people understand how this monetary system works, is that whenever somebody's getting out of debt, money is disappearing from the economy, which means that either somebody else has to borrow again or essentially the economy shrinks. So if we all try and pay off our debts, then the economy as a whole goes into recession. So the government, after the crisis, had the choice between these two options. The one they went for was this. They said, we need to get banks lending again. We need to encourage people to take out mortgages to buy ever more expensive houses, because the more that people borrow, the more money is created, and that's the way that they want to get the economy going again. Now, that's really dangerous because too much debt was what caused the crisis. So piling on more debt on top of that surely can't be the solution. Okay. And actually, we've been warning about this for a while, but this is Adair Turner, who was the head of the Financial Services Authority right up until March of last year. This is what he's been saying about it. We got into this mess because of excessive creation of private credit and money we should be concerned if our only escape route implies building up a future excess. Basically, we let the banks create too much money before the crisis, and now we're trying to use that as the way to get the economy going again. So this is really dangerous. So just to sum up these sort of key points so far, banks create money when they make loans. They create too much money in the good times because when they get overconfident, they lend to anybody, as they did in the years running up to 2007. And this leads to the creation of more money. They put most of that money into property markets and the financial markets, not actually into businesses, which is what many people assume they do. When we repay loans, money disappears from the economy. And what that means is we're essentially dependent on debt. We've effectively got to borrow the money that we use to run our economy from the banking system. And it makes it very difficult for people to pay down that debt. Okay, so the consequences of this, I'm going to go through a few of the different consequences. I want you to think, as I go through these, like which of these either have affected your life up until now or will affect you in the next sort of 10 or 20 years. Because the way this system works, if you're not studying economics, it might seem that money and banking is something really dry that you don't need to know about. But the whole world is made up of people doing things in exchange for money. So the monetary system affects almost every aspect of our lives. So at the end, I'm going to ask a couple of people to just explain how they think this has some sort of effect on them. So the first one, debt. So as I said, the current system creates money when people go into debt. When the crisis hit, you can't really see this, but this is 2007 here, the level of personal debt peaked just before the crisis hit. And you would then think that since then, people would have tried to pay down those debts. What has actually happened is that the level of debt has stayed pretty much flat. It came down very slightly, but now it's going back up again. So by 2018, we'll have more personal debt than we had at the time when the financial crisis hit. This is what I was saying about the government wanting to get the economy going again by getting people to borrow more. Some of the impacts of that, I mean, firstly, because housing has become so unaffordable, you have about 5,000 families made homeless every single year. 3.9 million families have only enough savings for 1 month's rent or mortgage. That's a really bad position to be in. That is actually about 1 in 5 families in the UK. And it means you only need one person to unexpectedly lose their job, and those families can be in severe financial dire straits. The poorest 10% of households now owe 4 times their household income. And if you're in the poorest 10% of earners, and you owe 4 years worth of your salary, you're not going to get out of debt. That's going to be with you essentially until you die or until you default. Okay. Then the other big impact is on house prices. So you've probably heard, I mean, this is the way that housing is normally talked about, is the UK is a small island and we have too many people here and not enough houses. So there's a small element of truth in that we haven't been building enough houses for about 20 years. But this chart here shows you, the purple line here is house prices since 1990 until 2010. This green line at the bottom is the population of the UK. So it's been growing pretty slowly, really. This red line is the number of houses, and that has actually grown slightly faster than the number of people in the country. The one that explains why house prices are this high is the line at the top, which is mortgage lending. So remember, every loan that a bank is making is creating new money, and all of this money, a large proportion of this money is going straight into the mortgage market. When you pump that amount of money into the house price, into the housing market, that's what happens to house prices. So what explains why housing now is so unaffordable is the fact that banks have had this ability to create money, and most of the money they've created has gone into housing. So this is how many times of your salary you'd have to give up to buy the first house. For the UK, it's 4.6 times. If you're in London, 7.5 times. This is close to historical highs. And then this is basically what this shows is if you're a first-time buyer, once you've paid your tax, the money that lands into your bank account, how much of that are you giving up to pay the mortgage? And so it's currently at 30% for the UK as a whole. if you look back over that red line, it doesn't look necessarily that high historically. The scary thing, though, is this blue line at the bottom is interest rates. And interest rates are at a 300-year low, and yet the affordability is still here. So think what happens once those interest rates go up. A lot of the people that are buying their first houses right now are really going to struggle to afford to pay those mortgages once the interest rates start going up. Okay. Another impact is inequality. So this is kind of it's fairly simplistic, but we need money to circulate in the economy in order to keep businesses running and people employed and people trading, and basically to make the economy work. But because all that money has to be created by the banking system, we're effectively renting it from the banks. What that means is we're paying interest on all of the money that we use to keep our economy going. And that's causing a big redistribution back to the financial sector, back to the banks. What this means across the whole economy is that the bottom 90% of the population pay more interest to the banking system than they ever receive on their loans. Than they ever receive on their savings. Only the top 10% receive more interest than they actually pay out. So what you have is a redistribution from the bottom 90% of the population to the very top 10%. And the data doesn't break down that top 10% any more finely, but I think within that you'd find an even bigger distribution to the top 1 or 2%. So this is another one of the things that's driving the big rise in inequality that we have at the moment. And again, the other thing that drives inequality is housing. Just a quick show of hands, who's studying economics here? Oh, pretty much everybody. How many of you are familiar with this whole discussion about Thomas Piketty's book that came out quite recently? Okay, so basically, Thomas Piketty has written this book, which just shows how there's been a huge rise in inequality over the last few centuries, particularly over the last few decades. But what he doesn't really flag up in there is that the biggest part of that rise in inequality is in the form of housing wealth. Because the richer you are, the bigger the house you can get, the bigger the mortgage you can get, the more you benefit from house prices being artificially inflated through the system in which money is created and pumped into the housing market. So it's another big driver of inequality. It has implications for democracy. So the issue that you raised earlier on, the people who decide how to spend that money basically decide who gets to produce what and who gets paid for what. We tend to think that politicians are in charge of spending most of the money that shapes the economy. So in the 5 years running up to the financial crisis, we had the government spending a total of £2.1 trillion over that 5 years. You had 650 MPs monitoring how that money was being spent and holding them to account, scrutinising what it was being spent on. You also had all the press and all the news cameras looking at how that money was being spent. But in the same time, you had the 5 big banks. They created a total of £2.9 trillion in that time. And they decided where that money would go to in the economy. And with those 5 big banks, you only really had about 80 board members across them all deciding, in the board level meetings, do we want to focus on lending to business, do we want to focus on lending to property, or to investing in the financial markets? So you have a huge concentration of power within those people at the top of the big banks. And that's something that, because this power to create money isn't very well understood, not many people are paying attention to the impact that the banking system has on shaping our economy. Okay, the environment, firstly, some of the impacts of this. Firstly, because banks create the money, they decide where that goes, what they invest in. We don't have much influence over that. There is no transparency over how your savings are used with any of the big banks. I mean, you can't say to them, I don't want you to invest in this or that. You don't have that option, unless you look at maybe some of the very small ethical banks like Triodos or Cooperative to some extent. And then boom and bust. is, this isn't really mentioned very much, but the instability that you have in the economy, which I would argue comes from the fact that the banks have this ability to create huge sums of money and blow up the economy and then trigger a recession. Whenever the recession hits, then that's an opportunity for government to come in and say, well, you know, all of this environmental protection stuff, that's really red tape, and we can't afford that right now because we need to get the economy growing again. So what the coalition has done is use that as an opportunity to pull back a lot of the environmental protections, and a lot of the progress that's been made over the 20 years before, they've then started to pull away, because they've become, you know, super short term, and everything right now is about we must get the economy growing again. So this instability creates this short-termism, which makes it difficult for governments to plan for the long term, which is what we really need to be doing right now. It also has an impact on taxes and public spending. So this is one way. When the Bank of England creates paper money, it makes a profit on doing so because it doesn't cost £10 to print a £10 note. And all of that profit each year goes into the Treasury, and it reduces how much taxes we have to pay. And it's quite a significant amount. It works out about the same as airport taxes. In 2009, it was enough to pay for 120,000 nurses, just to put it into some kind of perspective. But because the government doesn't create electronic money, and it leaves that to the banks, it doesn't gain the profit on creating electronic money, only on cash. So it's getting the proceeds on creating this amount of physical cash, but it's losing everything basically between the green line and the blue line. And we've calculated that that would amount to about 60 billion a year of additional revenue for the government if they were also to take on the responsibility for creating electronic money instead of leaving that to the banks. I think I calculated it would cost about 25 billion a year to give everybody free university education. So that might be a popular idea. So all of these different consequences, this is the governor of the central bank, governor of the Bank of England up until last year, I think it was last year? Yeah, June last year. And he gave a speech sort of shortly after the crisis where he said this, of all the many ways of organising banking, the worst is the one we have today. And this is the guy in charge of the banking system. So, it's pretty messed up. So, yeah, so those consequences, debt, house prices, inequality, the environmental crisis, the cuts to government spending, which of these have affected you or are going to affect you in the near future, in the next 10 or 20 years? Just take a couple of minutes to discuss it, and then maybe a couple of people can say about their experience. So, go ahead. Okay. I'd be really interested to hear from maybe a couple of people about what they thought, how this might affect them, either up until now or in the past, in the future. Is anybody up for saying something? Go ahead.
In the Telegraph, basically saying, to put it politely, he was up the Swanee. Yeah. So, okay. Well, for me, the problem is the inequality problem. It's anti-democratic. The present politics of this country, to my mind, are just powered by ignorance. In Spain, as a consequence of suffering from similar problems, they've actually gone the other way. Podemos, which is another political party in Spain, not equivalent to UKIP, has taken left-wing view, is now as popular, according to opinion polls, as UKIP. So,
okay, brilliant. Yeah, that's good. I did a talk last night, and somebody said, well, so this guy was retired. He said, I've done really well out of it. I've got a big pension, I've got a big house, it's worth a fortune, I paid off the mortgage. But my son calls me up and he is really struggling. So it's a kind of intergenerational thing as well. There's been a big transfer of wealth from young to the older, but it's also, in the process of that, it's the banks that have been taking a lot in the in the interim. Like the bigger mortgage you have, the more of your salary you spend on that mortgage, the more of your salary goes on interest, the more interest there is for the banking sector. So if you can inflate the price of houses, then that's really good for the banking sector as a whole. Does anybody else want to say anything? Yeah, at the back. I mean, maybe if you could just pass the microphone up there.
Thanks. Can people hear me? Yeah. I am not able to work because I'm disabled, and that means I rely on benefits. And I recently tried to move out of my parents' place, but I found out that because price properties are so high, the differential between how much housing benefit that councils can afford and how much is actually paid, how much you actually have to pay, means that I'm not going to be able to move out of my parents probably for the foreseeable future, even though I'm 33. So for people who are vulnerable and there not being enough social housing, it's becoming a massive problem for a lot of disabled people, just finding somewhere that they can afford to live.
Excellent, thanks for sharing that. Anybody else? So, yeah, down, just over there.
I expected when I retired, this isn't making any difference.
It is.
Is
yeah.
it?
Yeah.
I expected when I retired that I'd have some savings as well as a house to live in. But in fact, most of my savings went on buying the last house I now live in. So that's made a big difference to me and my expectation.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, just on the cuts to government spending, for example, one of the reasons why the government, okay, I don't want to go too far into this, but basically the story has been, well, the government spent too much and that's why they now have all this debt. Actually, the debt rose because there was a banking crisis which led to a recession, which meant people were earning less, so they were paying less tax, and the government's income fell. And because of that, they had to still keep spending on what they'd already planned to spend on. That meant they had to borrow to make up the difference. But if you had not had the banking system that we had, we wouldn't have had the recession in the first place. So none of this would have been necessary. And this is one of the reasons why we need to change the system, so that the costs of banking failures don't get passed back onto the public through the government finances. So is anybody thinking this now? Like, why didn't I know this? I mean, the economic students, you might have done something about banking. You might have done something about the money multiplier in your course, potentially. So you might have some idea of this. But we recently did a survey of members of parliament to find out how many of them understood that most of the money, actually 97% of money, is created by banks when they make loans. We found out that 71% of them said that only the government could create money, including the electronic money in your bank account. This is completely wrong. We found only 1 out of 10 MPs actually understood the way the system really works, that banks create money when they lend, and that money is destroyed when loans are repaid. So most members of parliament don't really understand how this monetary system works. And this is a clip from last Thursday, when for the first time in 170 years, MPs in parliament actually had a discussion about money creation and who should be allowed to create money. We've been working on making that happen for about 6 months. But I'll just play you a quick clip from one MP, and there's sound on this, and hopefully this will work. Okay. So what he's saying.
Members of Parliament don't really understand how money is created, and I really believe that is the majority position, certainly based on discussions I have been having. How on earth can we be confident that the reforms we brought in over the course of the last few years are going to work, are going to prevent repeat collapse of the sort which we saw before the last election? And my view is that we can't be confident. I think these issues need to be explored, and I think it is time for a monetary commission to be established and for Parliament then to become much more engaged than we have been. This is a very small step in that direction.
Okay, so that was a Conservative MP basically saying most of the MPs he's spoken to did not understand how money was created, as the survey that we did suggested. And what he was saying is, if we can't understand how money is created, how on earth can we actually assess all of this regulation that's going through all of these banking reforms to figure out if they're going to stop another crisis? And it's the first time we've really had an admission from any MP talking about how the system works and how poorly MPs understand it. And you've got to give some credit to him for actually having the honesty to say that. Okay. So how can we change it? What my organisation, Positive Money, is advocating is something that we call a sovereign money system. The idea of this is that instead of having, in the current system, you basically have bank money. So money is always created by banks in the current system. We're saying you should stop banks being able to create money because we've seen that they can't really handle that responsibility. And we should take that power to create money back. So the first part of this, this reform is to take the power to create money away from the banks and return it to some kind of transparent, democratic, accountable body that's working in the public interest. That might, as I said, from what we've seen, we shouldn't really be trusting the banks with this power to create money because they have the incentive to abuse it, to put most of it into property bubbles, to cause the kind of financial crisis we've had. But nobody's really suggesting that we should trust these guys either. If you give George Osborne the power to create money, and he's got 12 months to go to an election, then you're going to find that he suddenly wants to turn on the printing press to pay for whatever he thinks will win votes. So can't trust the banks, can't trust the politicians. What you need to do to make sure that there's no conflict of interest over this power to create money is separate two parts of the decision. One is how much money should we be creating? The other one is what do we use that money for? As soon as the same person or the same organization is making two decisions, you have a conflict of interest. So what we're suggesting is you would have a committee, we call it the Money Creation Committee, but it could just be a committee at the Bank of England. And they would decide how much money to create after looking at how the whole economy is doing and what is actually needed. And then they would transfer that money to the government. Then it's up for the government to decide how to spend it in the same way that they decide how to spend all of our tax revenue. Okay. And then there's these three options for them to get that money into the economy. Firstly, they could spend it through government spending. They could use it to reduce taxes and use that money that they receive to cover the loss of tax revenue. Or this other one is the idea, it's called citizens' dividend. The idea is that you would just, when the Bank of England would create new money, it would be divided up equally between everybody. Everybody would get a bank transfer, and then it's their choice how they want to spend it, whether they want to pay off debts or whether they want to buy things. So just, again, with the person next to you, just take a minute or two to think about which of these options you would choose, or maybe a mix of all three. And again, I'm going to ask a couple of people to suggest why. So, what did people go for? Who went for the government spending? Yeah? Tax cuts? And a citizens' dividend? Oh, this is about an equal split. Who went for a mix of all three or two? Yeah? Okay. Anybody want to say why? What they chose? Go ahead. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Maybe you could pass the microphone down as well. Oh, sorry. Behind you, sorry, and then we'll come back down. Yeah.
Well, I was all for lots of government spending myself, because it's not just roads, it's schools, it's libraries, it's hospitals, it's almost everything. And I think that this sort of focus on the individual has got to a ridiculous extreme since the Thatcher years, and we need to go back to understanding the value for all of us in having a society that is rich, not necessarily rich individuals. But the other thing we were talking about here, and it's a question really for maybe for later, but in this model, who then would lend to businesses, for example? Would that come out of government spending? Would you have like a sort of local enterprise zones, and then the money would go to them and they would, because someone still needs to do the lending, don't they?
Yeah. Well, so the idea is banks would still be able to lend, they would lend using money from savers. So yeah, real money that they got from savers rather than money that they created in the process of lending. But there's bigger problems with lending to business, which is that the banks have lost interest in it, really. So there's other reforms that need to be made for that as well. Just have one other suggestion. Okay.
Hi. Wouldn't all these just cause inflation?
Good question. On the inflation questions, the idea is if you just create money, it causes inflation. If you look at the money that the banks have been creating up until now, because most of it went into property, that's where you got the inflation. But in simplistic terms, basically, if you have a load of people unemployed or you have a load of capacity in the economy and you put money into those parts of the economy, what you actually get is more output, more economic activity. So for example, if after the crisis, if some of the money that had been created through quantitative easing had actually been spent on building sustainable houses, it wouldn't have caused inflation because there were 90,000 construction workers made unemployed in 2012. What it would have done is got those people back into work, but it wouldn't have actually pushed prices up. Only really starts to push prices up if you put money into the economy when the economy is already kind of running at full speed, or if you put money into one part of the economy that can't expand. It's kind of a simplistic way of looking at it, but that's the kind of broad analysis. Okay, so I'll just move on a bit then. So the second big thing you need to do with changing this system is instead of creating money by lending, you need to create money free of debt. Now what this means is, I showed you this equation where we either have to choose between more money and more debt, or less debt and less money. And that's because banks only create new money when people go into debt. What switching to a sovereign money system where the central bank creates money and then the government spends that money into the economy allows you to do is this, essentially, to get new money coming into the economy, but allow that money to be used to pay off the old debts. And that's really the only way that you can break out of this connection between the amount of money and the amount of debt, and reduce this sort of dependency on debt. As I was just saying, banks would still have a function. They would still be lenders, but they would lend money they would take money from savers and actually lend it to borrowers, the way that most people think they operate right now. Okay. And then the third thing is you need to make sure that new money comes into the real economy rather than the financial markets. So as I was saying before, in the current system, the majority of money that banks create goes straight into the housing and financial markets. Only about 8% goes into businesses outside the financial sector, into the real economy. And the rest goes into credit cards and personal loans. What we want to do is get money coming into the real economy. So that could be through lending to businesses, but it could also be, actually it would mainly be through getting more money into people's pockets so that they have more money to spend. And if you've been following the discussion since the financial crisis, there's been a lot of talk about banks aren't lending to businesses. But actually there was a survey done last year where a load of thousands of UK businesses were asked, what is the biggest thing holding you back in terms of growing as a business? 7% of them said we can't get access to loans from banks. 40% of them said we can't get the sales. So basically it's not that they can't get the access to finance, it's that they can't actually, basically their customers don't have enough money to spend. Part of the reason for that is because you've had a recession, because people have so much debt that a lot of their salary is going on debt repayments, and most of their salary is being eaten up by the mortgage. Okay. So just to quickly compare the two systems, in the current system, money is created by banks when they make loans. In a sovereign money system, money would be created only by the Bank of England. In the current system, money is created with debt attached, because it's only created when people go into debt. In the sovereign money system, it would be created without debt, and that money would be spent into the real economy. In the current system, most of the money goes into property and financial markets. And then in sovereign money, most of that money is put into the real economy instead. And then finally, in the current system, banks tend to create either too much money or too little. They create too much in the good years when they're feeling confident, and then when the crisis hits, they create too little. In a sovereign money system, you can actually balance the amount of money that you're creating to balance out the economy. So if things are good, you create less, and if things are bad, if you're in a recession, you can create more to get things going again. Okay. So is it actually possible? We get this question quite often. It's like, yeah, obviously the banking system is a complete mess. Obviously it needs reforming, but they are so powerful and they're so closely connected to government. Is it even possible to change things? We've been campaigning on this issue for about 4 years. We wrote a book called Modernizing Money, which actually there's some copies outside. The chief economics correspondent for the Financial Times has recently picked this book up, and he wrote about it in this article here. He said, we need to strip banks of their power to create money. This is one of the most influential people writing for the FT, which is the financial paper for the financial sector. This is what he concludes in his article. He says, this proposal would bring huge advantages. It would be possible to increase the money supply without encouraging people to borrow to the hilt. It would end too big to fail in banking. It would also transfer seigniorage, which is the proceeds from creating money, to the public. So this is somebody who has been reporting on financial markets and the banking system for his whole life, who's now saying we need to make these radical changes before the next crisis hits. Again, we just had this debate in Parliament for the first time in 170 years where MPs are actually talking about this issue of, should we really allow banks to create money? And another MP who was speaking there said what he said was, would Parliament have ever voted to hand the power to create money to the same banks that caused the financial crisis? He said, I think the answer is an unambiguous no. And most of the MPs were sat around nodding as well. We've been campaigning around the country and also internationally. We've got about 20 groups around the country. There is also a group in Devon. I've been speaking around Devon the last couple of nights. If you want to get involved in that in some way or in campaigning around this, maybe speak to the guys who will be at the table outside once the event's finished. You can also leave your email address as well. We have about 37,000 people on the Facebook group. We have 10,000 people on Twitter. You wouldn't think that it was easy to get that many people interested in reforming the banking system, because normally it's left for economists and people in government, but there's all kinds of people who are getting involved in this because it does affect every aspect of people's lives. And if you're not from the UK, we've also got sister organisations in about 20 different countries. So, and then if you want more information, just check out the Positive Money website. There's a load of things on there, a lot of animations, videos. If you are doing the banking module on your course and your lecturer hasn't told you to read our material already, there's a whole 50-minute video course on there which explains how money is created in the current system with all the kind of technical details that you need to understand about banking. The book that video series is based on is the book that the Bank of England's article references as well. So it's a more accurate understanding of how the banking system works than you'll get from the American textbooks, which are really, at a minimum, about 30 years out of date. So the key point of this, though, is if money is power, then we need to have a discussion about who should have the power to create money. Because if you have that power, you can shape society. And we've given that power to the same banks that have caused the financial crisis. They have used it essentially to make housing unaffordable, to widen inequality. I'm not saying this is all intentional or designed, but it's been the product of allowing banks to have this power and then to chase their own self-interest. And what we need to have now, what we're trying to create, is a real debate about who should have that power and whether it should be brought back under some kind of democratic control. So, to find out more, if I went a bit too fast today, get on the Positive Money website. There's a load of information there about how the system works and what we're doing to change it. And we've got about 25 minutes for questions. and then I've got to run away and get a train. So, so there's a microphone somewhere. Who's got the mic? Oh, there it is. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. In the economic sphere, this is your campaign. Our campaign is the best thing that's happened for years. Now, the debate you got in Parliament was very good. It was surprisingly positive, but there were only 30 MPs in the chamber. I invited Ben Bradshaw, our MP, to be here tonight. He's a decent man. He's a good MP, but he admitted to me he knows nothing about the financial system. Now, almost the first thing the group should do is to arrange a meeting with Ben Bradshaw to educate him in this extraordinarily important initiative, it seems to me. We often complain that MPs are out of touch with the public. Well, they're not out of touch with the public. The fault is with the public. The fault is with us, that we're out of touch with our MPs. And I wonder how many people here have ever spoken to Ben. So we really must get going on arranging a meeting with Ben as soon as possible.
Okay, good stuff. Yeah, maybe if we, so who's next down? If you just bring it down. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello.
Hey.
Now, I'm English, but I live in France, and my parents have lived in France for the past 25 years. And I wanted to know, you gave us an example tonight of what happens in England with paper money and electronic money. Is it the same in the Eurozone on the continent? Is it the European Central Bank that are printing the money and the European banks that are creating electronic money? Is it the same system in Europe, in the Eurozone?
Yeah. So the question was, is this the same system in Europe? Essentially, yes. Pretty much every country around the world is using this same system now. And pretty much every country around the world is having problems with household debt and government finances at the moment as a result. It's sometimes the rules are slightly different, and sometimes it's managed more or less tightly. So for example, in China it was always managed very tightly, but when the recession hit, they realized that was going to harm their exports. So they said, we need to ramp up money creation by our own banks to keep our economy going with newly created Chinese money instead of dollars that they'd earned from exports. What they did was they completely let go of control, and the level of credit since the crisis, the level of credit and money created by banks relative to the economy, relative to GDP in China has gone from about 100% to 200% since the financial crisis. So now in China, they're really worried about whether they're going to have a banking crisis, because they've done exactly what we did in this country, but just about 7 or 8 years later. But short answer is it's pretty much the same in every country in the world. Okay, you had a question as well, yeah. Oh. Got a new battery. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. That was really good. I agree with large parts of what you've said. There are a couple of issues, but my main one would be, how do you transition from the current system to your proposed one? Like, what happens to the debt people already have if you're imposing 100% reserve ratios on banks? How long is it going to take them to get up to that? So basically, how are you going to transition from the current system to your ideal one? Yeah,
it's a good question. You can do it quite gradually. So one thing you can do overnight is convert all of the bank-created money in people's accounts into money at the Bank of England. That's a very simple thing to do, and then that stops, with some other changes behind the scenes, it stops banks creating new money. It also means that everybody who wants their money to be safe actually has safe money at the Bank of England instead of money at RBS or wherever. Then over the longer term, so as I was saying before, as this new money is created by the Bank of England and there's no additional debt attached to that, as that money comes into the real economy, it's available to people to start paying off their debts. And over a period of about 10 or 15 years, we think the level of debt, personal and household debt relative to the size of the economy, can shrink from about, I think it's about 150% of GDP now, should be able to come down significantly to maybe about 60 or 70% of GDP. So the impact of that is significantly less debt across the whole economy, less debt for people to live in, and that also means the economy is safer as well, because the more debt you have, the greater the risk of financial crisis. So you can do it smoothly. There are ways of doing it without a big shock to the economy. Okay, yeah, just pass it down.
I very much applaud what you're attempting to do, and I have signed up to your campaign. But in order for you to be successful in this campaign, it would appear that, if I understand you correctly, that if only we could persuade the government to follow your advice, then you would be able to achieve the end result. But sadly, I don't think it's as simple as that. It presupposes that the government is actually in charge of all of this. And if I can quote the founder of the Rothschild dynasty, Amsel Rothschild, who said that, give me control over the creation of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws. What I would suggest, and there is plenty of evidence for this in the literature, is that it is not the governments who are actually in control of this. Ultimately, it is the likes of the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and so on.
Okay, so
I'd be interested in your comments on that. And this is all described very well in, among other places, a book called Web of Debt by Ellen Hodgson Brown.
So yeah, I mean, the banks are obviously powerful. I mean, they're very closely connected to government. There's a lot of revolving doors between the banks and the government. So for example, the guy, not Adair Turner, who was the chairman of the Financial Services Authority, but Hector Sanz, who is the chief executive of the SCA. I mean, the guy who was basically asleep at the wheel all the way running up to the financial crisis and after it as well. His next job after he left the Financial Services Authority was to be the head of regulation at Barclays. So he's the guy who's supposed to stop the banks misbehaving, and then he goes straight to Barclays. Let's take some more questions because there's a lot of people. But yeah, I mean, that power between the banks is something that is one of the reasons why we focus really on educating a lot of, we want people to understand how the system works. So it's not just a discussion between the banks and people working at the Treasury about how they should reform the system. We need some public input into that. Go ahead.
Good evening. Yeah, thanks. Really enjoyed that. Quite informative. I just wanted to know, is Positive Money and you, is it pro-Keynesian or pro-Austrian, and why?
We're not pro-Austrian. We probably lean more towards the Keynesian side. I mean, it's quite obvious. So, for example, quantitative easing, all of that money was created and went straight into the financial markets. If you had spent just 10 billion out of that 375 billion on something like building, sustainable, affordable homes, unemployment would have fallen. You'd have employed a lot of people. That would have boosted the economy by the same amount as 375 billion of QE. So we think it's pretty obvious that there is much more potential for, to get yourself out of a recession through using the power to create money in the right way rather than leaving it to the banks. I mean, yeah, that's kind of it.
And you said you would touch on Bitcoin. Were you going to do that later?
Yeah. I think Bitcoin's interesting. I haven't really got time to explain what it is in case anybody's not familiar. But I think it's interesting. But I think also people have got overexcited about how much it is going to change things. The Bank of England released a paper on that about 2 months ago, actually, which is really an interesting read. And they sort of studied Bitcoin to see if there was any threat really to the financial system from that. They said there's only about 20,000 people in the UK who have Bitcoin. They don't use it very much for making payments, and so far it's a really interesting idea, but it's economically insignificant in terms of the amount of money that is transferred through it. Yeah. So just who else has got questions, just so I can see how many there is? Yeah. Okay, so we'll come down this way then. Could you pass it down?
Hi, thanks, Ben. Three of us are here from Extra Pound, and rather than take the time to explain what the Extra Pound is and the arguments for it, it's all neatly summarised on the leaflets that you've got in front of you on the back. one item that we haven't got there is that I wondered if you'd agree that we might be able to argue with people that by looking at adopting a local currency, a parallel currency, it means that people question the financial system, and that would lend towards people questioning the system and looking at alternatives such as that for positive money. Or would you say, like Bitcoin, we're economically insignificant?
I think like Bitcoin, it gets people to think about how money works and how it could work differently. One of the arguments I sometimes hear is, it's too difficult to change things through politics, so we should just do things locally. I think it's really good to do the complementary currencies, the different kind of schemes that you can do locally to get people to think about how they live and how money works and how it affects things. I think we shouldn't ever forget that the local things alone can't cancel out all the bad that is done by a national system that works the way we have, the way the current system works. So as well as doing things locally, we have to keep an eye on how the national system is working, and we have to change it. Yeah. But yeah, so everybody's got a flyer on the Exeter Pound. Okay. Yeah. So check that out. That's another good scheme. Yeah. Can we pass it down here? Yeah. So.
There's a lot of stuff going around on the net that the Federal Reserve is a private institution and the Bank of England is a private. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so the Bank of England isn't. It's fully owned by the state. It was private up until 1947 or 1948 when it was nationalised. Since then, it's been basically a government department, although it has some sort of independence from government. The Federal Reserve has quite a weird structure in that legally it has shareholders, which are the banks themselves. And that's kind of from the history of it, where the Federal Reserve banks were set up kind of to support all the other banks in their operations. And that still has that structure. So there's questions about, who influences the Federal Reserve and who are they really working for? Are they working on behalf of the public or on behalf of the banks? And I think from the history of the financial crisis, you can say the same about the Bank of England, but what they've done really has benefited the banks. It's really been about protecting the banks more than it has been about getting the real economy going again. They would say that was because they believe that if you keep the banking system safe and stable and going, then eventually the rest of the economy would benefit as well. But there's very different ways they could have done things. So, yeah, did you want to pass it?
Thanks for your talk. I think ultimately, theoretically, I agree with everything you've said. But the fact of the matter is that you would need to get MPs on board. And their only job is to get votes. They know that. They look at the short-term approach and act purely for themselves. As a result, voters then vote for what's likely to work for them as an individual. So there will be a lot of people who don't agree with what you said. I do, and I would still not be inclined to vote for a party that came with something similar to this, because the opportunity cost of my vote for a party coming up with this idea that's likely to lose, based on game theory or whatever you want to call it, if everyone else doesn't vote, I'd be losing out on voting for maybe Conservative instead of Lib Dems. And because people act in their own best interest, I'm never going to, whatever my beliefs are, not act in my own best interest, despite of, in spite of what I think you're saying.
Yeah, so I think, maybe the point is if a small party advocates this, people still aren't going to vote for the small party because in the end you've got a choice of Labour versus Tory. I think that means two things. Basically, you have to get it to the point where it's not, you can't push through massive change like this through small parties advocating it. You have to do it through getting the media, the academics, the experts, the general public to talk about an issue to the point where it becomes almost common sense that you need change. And then you get it in, it has to come in from the government, really. The other question is kind of off topic for tonight, but do you want to break the voting system by just voting for small parties until the point where there's nobody gets an overall majority and then they have to change the voting system? So that would be a question. Yeah. Okay. So. Okay. Yeah. So, are there any questions down here? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. How do you think that implementing this, your model, your system, would impact the economy's international competitiveness, or global trade and into the global economy?
So the common assumption is that if you do this kind of reform without other countries doing it, you'll have a disadvantage. Firstly, it doesn't have any impact on how you trade with other countries. There's no kind of practical reason why you can't continue trading, even though you've changed your system in one country. What it also does is it makes your banking system safer, and it also gives your savers, your consumers, because there would be less debt in the economy, and hopefully because house prices wouldn't be so artificially inflated, they would have more disposable income, which means it's a better environment for business, really, because you want consumers who can actually spend money because they've got some money left over. So I would say you'd actually get a first mover advantage from making a change like this, although most people would assume you'd get the first mover disadvantaged. Okay. Go ahead down there.
Yes, somebody earlier talked about the reserve ratio going up to 100%. But actually, you haven't proposed the end of fractional reserve banking, have you? You're proposing there can't be a bank loan until someone's put a deposit in the bank first. That's not the same thing as saying there can't be a bank loan unless that bank has that amount of money deposited at the central bank.
Okay, that could get quite technical, and there's only 8 minutes left. But basically, what we're proposing is some specific changes to banks that would stop them being able to create the form of liabilities, which in the banking jargon are known as demand deposits, the numbers that are in your account that you use as money. So these changes would stop banks being able to create that. They would still take money from savers and lend it out, but it would stop them creating this form of money that we all use.
But that would still be fractional reserve banking. I wondered whether you wanted to get rid of that as well.
It wouldn't be. It wouldn't be. Basically, it would stop fractional reserve banking. Yeah. I don't really want to go into balance sheets and things right now to explain how this works. But
well, I don't want to go on for too long, but I mean the money multiplier model, which you quite rightly said is a nonsensical way of describing the banks, that would describe the system you proposed, wouldn't it? And that involves fractional reserve banking.
No, you wouldn't. No, it's going to be too technical to go through why it's different from that, but it does stop it. Yeah. Are there any women who would like to ask a question? Can we pass the microphone over?
I wish we could have the new system. I'm worried about getting there. You have described it in a way that it's win-win all the way. But you haven't touched on who is going to lose out in the transition and why. And whoever that is, they are going to be the biggest obstacle.
That's a good question. Very good question. Well, obviously, the way this system currently works acts as a subsidy for the banks. So the banks are going to resist this hugely. And they resist any kind of change that comes from government or any kind of regulation because it's in their interest to do so. But they will be one of the main obstacles to this. Interestingly, some parts of the financial sector might benefit from this. For example, pension funds would benefit from a more stable economy, so they might be in favour of this. I think one group that would lose out a bit from these changes is the groups that would benefit from another house price bubble. So buy-to-let landlords with multiple properties, and to be fair, people who are retired, who are relying on that wealth being inflated again. So I think, definitely some people are not going to end up as well, but I think if you look at it over the economy as a whole, if you do a change that sort of stops the boom and bust, which has been a result of this money creation by the banking sector, on average that should benefit everybody. It's not actually a zero-sum game. When you have a recession like we've had, everybody loses out by the fact that you have 1 million people sat at home doing nothing when they could be out there, improving roads, building railway lines, building sustainable houses. Like, everybody loses from that, and the whole of society. So I think the benefits to people would be greater than the losses to some people. Another question? Okay.
Your money creation committee, or whatever it's called, who's gonna sit on it? How are they going to agree? It seems like economists haven't got a great track record of understanding how the economy works and anticipating problems and so on. So this incredibly important committee, how are you going to get people on it with the wisdom to make the right decisions?
It's a really good question, because again, these people have the power to create money. So one of the important things to recognize is they might not get it right all the time, but what they're doing, their job is to respond to what the economy is doing and then adjust accordingly. When you have the power to create money with banks, when they, for example, create too much money for the property market and they see prices going up, they take that as a cue to create even more money, which makes prices go up even faster. This committee, because their job is actually to look at the economy as a whole, if they saw property prices were rising at 10 or 20% a year, they would see that as a sign that there's too much money flooding into the economy, so they would take it as a sign to hold back. So it's not that they can necessarily get the right answer every time, it's that they're looking for the right answer actually. They're thinking about what the economy as a whole needs, rather than sort of looking at how to chase their own profit for the next quarterly results, which is what the banks are doing. And with regards to who the actual committee is, if you want to take the least radical option, you have the Monetary Policy Committee that sets interest rates. So they would stop setting interest rates and they'd adjust how quickly money is created. Or you could have it more radical. It could be on a jury service basis. You just take, 20 people from the population. The important thing is that everybody knows who these people are, what decisions they make, that it's completely transparent, that they're accountable to Parliament. So the Treasury Select Committee, which is a cross-party group of MPs, can call the body in and say, look, why are you making these decisions in this way? What's your thinking for that? And for the first time, you'd actually have the power to create money out in the open in some sort of transparency, rather than the current system where it's not transparent at all. We've got time for one more question, so it's got to be a good one. Yeah, could you pass it back 2 rows, please?
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for coming to Exeter. I just wanted to know really what your campaign focus is. I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea. It all looks great to me. Certainly has a lot of benefits of our current system. Unfortunately, I think the people who are in power at the moment won't necessarily benefit as much as the general population. I would vote with my feet. I don't see any political party particularly favouring this system. I don't see the House of Lords showing any particular interest, and I was hugely disappointed in the 30 MPs turning up for the discussion. My own MP has still neglected to enter dialogue with myself about the situation. So I guess I'm really asking, what are you looking to achieve in the future? What areas are you targeting? Obviously, educationally, you're talking to people in the public and you're gaining some traction, but it seems small.
So, so don't underestimate how long it takes to make massive changes like this. It's a really fundamental change to the financial system and actually to the economy as a whole. So about 4 years ago when we set up, there was almost nobody talking about money creation. There was a few people who'd written books, there was a few people on internet forums talking about it, but it was not anywhere near the mainstream discussion. Like, there was no mention in the Financial Times of the fact that banks create money until about 2011. So the progress that's been made in about 4 years is, it seems like it might be small, but it's actually quite significant to get to this point where MPs actually debate this. And although it was only 30, it was a debate where there was no law being passed and no binding vote at the end. So the devolution debate afterwards, which had 80 MPs registered to vote, there was only about 35 MPs in the room for that as well. So the turnout wasn't as bad as we were expecting. And then in terms of how do you change these things, you can't just go straight in sort of head to head with the banks, because they do have huge power. The way you have to do this is by getting the wider discussion going, getting the journalists interested in this. There was an article in The Guardian this morning where Simon Jenkins, who is an economist but also the head of the National Trust, was saying, look, we should just be creating money and getting it directly to people instead of pumping it all through the financial markets in the current system. So more and more people are starting to talk about this, and influential people as well. People in the central bank, and there's some good signs, sort of things I can't talk about yet, but yeah, I mean it is I'm optimistic because there is a lot of interest from influential people and from everybody in changing this system, and I think we've got to keep pushing on that sort of interest. It's going to take a few years to get things changed, but I think it is possible. So on that optimistic note, I think I'll end. I've got a few minutes if anybody has any final questions, just come down, and then I've got to go and get a train. So thank you.
For coming tonight, and also for all of you for braving the cold, wet, dark weather, for turning up this evening. Thank you very much.